By the time the email arrived, my afternoon had already settled into its quiet rhythm. The office hummed with the low, constant sound of the air conditioner and the occasional click of keyboards. The rain, fine and steady, traced pale lines down the windows beside my desk, turning the city into a soft blur of gray and muted headlights. I had my head bent over a spreadsheet, a mug of lukewarm tea pressing a faint ring into a stack of sticky notes. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, until the subject line flashed onto my screen. Notice of pending property transfer, Crestwood Workshop. At first, my brain skimmed right past it. I almost deleted it, assuming it was one of those automated updates that cluttered my inbox. But Crestwood snagged me. No one called it that in emails unless it was serious. To me, it had only ever been Granddad's Workshop. I clicked. The email was from a development company I didn't recognize. They were pleased to notify me of a planned sale and redevelopment of the property at 72 Crestwood Lane, subject to final verification of ownership transfers. There was polite language about timelines, zoning, and legacy structures. At the bottom, in a sentence that felt like it slid a cold blade between my ribs, my name appeared. As per the contractual assignment signed by Ms. Delphine Armitage on March 14, 2011. I reread that line 3 times. My eyes started to sting, but not from tears. March 14, 2011. The month after my grandfather died. The month everything in our family had gone brittle and strange. I leaned back in my chair, the old fabric sighing under my weight. The office around me stayed the same. Someone laughed at something on their phone, the printer spat out pages in sharp bursts. None of them knew that one email had just reached back 14 years and pulled something loose in my chest. There were attachments, a scanned contract, some notices, a projected development plan that turned my grandfather's weathered wooden workshop into a glossy rectangle of glass and metal, framed by manicured trees. I clicked open the contract. My own signature stared back at me, younger and rounder, at the bottom of a dense block of legal language. The heading read, Temporary Transfer of Beneficial Interest. I didn't remember signing that. I remembered a bleary meeting at my uncle's kitchen table. I remembered being 19 and exhausted and told, it's just paperwork so the estate can be processed faster. I did not remember giving anyone permission to sell my grandfather's workshop. I minimized the window and stared at the rain. In my mind, I could see the workshop as it had been, dusty sunbeams catching sawdust in the air, the comforting smell of oil and wood shavings, my grandfather's radio murmuring old songs in the background. He told me, the last week before he went into the hospital, no matter what, Del, that place is for you. Somewhere you can always come back to. Now some development firm wanted to turn it into a lobby. My phone buzzed on the desk. A reminder to pick up my mother's medication on the way home. For a moment I just watched the screen dim again, my reflection ghosting faintly over it. My life had been small and careful for years, work, caregiving, long evenings where the past felt safely distant. Something in that email told me the past was done staying where I'd left it. I reopened the contract. I zoomed in on my signature, on the date, on the line above it that mentioned, permanent assignment of beneficial rights unless revoked in writing within 30 days. 30 days that had passed 14 years ago. The hum of the office faded to a dull, faraway sound. I felt as if someone had quietly, calmly reached into the foundation of my life and removed a brick I didn't even know was load-bearing. I closed the contract, forwarded the email to my personal address, and, with a steadiness I didn't quite feel, typed into the search bar, how to contest a contract you don't remember signing. The drive to my mother's house that evening felt shorter than usual, though the streetlights slid by in the same slow procession. The rain had turned into a mist that clung to the windshield, making the world look softer than it deserved to be. I parked in front of the small bungalow we'd moved into after selling my childhood home and sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The email from the developers sat in my personal inbox now, along with a copy of the scanned contract and a development brochure full of glossy renderings. I had read them all, line by line, during my lunch break, and again during the quiet 10 minutes before leaving work. Each time, the words felt a little more real. Inside the bungalow, the air was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and the vegetable soup my mother had reheated for herself. She sat in her usual chair by the window, cardigan wrapped around her thin shoulders, her eyes following the evening news on low volume. At the sound of the door, she looked up and smiled, though it arrived slower than it used to. "Delphine," she said, testing my name like something fragile. "You're early." "Traffic was kind," I replied, shrugging out of my coat. I kissed her forehead. Her skin felt cooler than the room. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, you know. Memory's a sieve." She tapped her temple and gave a small, wry smile. "Things fall right through." That was the part that made me the angriest, the idea that people had taken advantage of a family already bending under grief long before her memory began to fray. Back then, she had been sharp, but devastated. I had been barely an adult, trying to hold her together while barely holding myself. As I checked the pill organizer and refilled her water glass, my mind drifted back to my grandfather's promises. He'd built Crestwood Workshop himself, years before I was born. It sat behind his old house like a secret, the light always on even late into the night when he worked on furniture for neighbors or repaired anything with a hinge or a handle. He taught me how to sand wood, with the grain, always with the grain, and had set aside a corner with a small workbench just my size. That bench had my initials carved into it, crooked and deep. When my father left, the workshop had been our anchor, somewhere that smelled the same no matter what left or entered our lives. After my grandfather died, my uncle Victor had been the one to handle most of the estate. He was the eldest, the businessman, the one with the connections and, as he liked to remind us, the head for numbers. I remembered sitting at his kitchen table with my mother, a stack of papers between us, his voice soft and patient. "It's all standard," he'd said. "We just need to consolidate things. The house will go to me, but the workshop, Delphine, you'll still have access. This is just structure. You don't want to be stuck with taxes and maintenance at 19, do you?" I remembered my mother staring at the tablecloth, knuckles pale, trusting him because grief made it easier to hand over decisions to someone else. What I didn't remember was him ever saying the word permanent. I didn't remember being told I had only 30 days to revoke anything. I didn't remember agreeing to let anyone sell Crestwood to strangers who had never smelled sawdust in their lives. Standing in my mother's narrow kitchen, I realized what they were really taking wasn't just a building. It was the last intact piece of a promise. It was the idea that somewhere, in a world that had shrunk to rented apartments and second-hand furniture, there was still a place with my name carved into a bench. If the sale went through, there would be money, I assumed. A payout. Perhaps my uncle had already factored me into some neat calculation, one that translated memories and promises into a figure wired to a bank account. But what he didn't know, maybe what I hadn't known until that day, was that the workshop had become a quiet part of who I was. Losing it would mean losing the option to ever step back into that version of myself again. It would mean accepting that my grandfather's last promises weren't worth the paper they were written on. In the living room, the news anchor's voice droned on about markets and elections. My mother dozed off in her chair, her fingers still curled around the edge of her blanket. Outside, the mist drew halos around streetlights. In that gentle, ordinary scene, the stakes crystallized for me. If I did nothing, Crestwood would vanish, first physically, then gradually from the stories we told, until even my mother's sieve-like memory had nothing solid left to cling to. If I fought, I risked shattering what remained of our family's brittle peace. I risked being painted as ungrateful, greedy, difficult. I risked confronting things we had all quietly agreed never to look too closely at. I watched my mother's chest rise and fall, slow and thin, and I realized something simple, some things were worth remembering, no matter how much it hurt. Some promises had to be fought for, even if the fighting was done with documents and quiet resolve instead of raised voices. Later that night, after she was asleep and the house was dark, I sat alone at her dining table with my laptop open. The words of the contract glowed on the screen. My cursor hovered over a line, as per the agreement between Miss Delphine Armitage and Mr. Victor Hale. I closed my eyes and saw my grandfather's hands, steady and sure, guiding mine along the grain of a plank. "I'm not done with you," I whispered, to the workshop, to the past, to myself. Then I opened a new tab and searched for the name of the lawyer who had handled Granddad's estate all those years ago. The law office of Quan and Associates occupied a narrow second-floor space above a bakery that smelled of sugar and yeast. The bell over the bakery door chimed softly as I passed, climbing the worn wooden stairs. Outside, the sky was a flat, undecided gray, the air holding the faint chill of early spring. When I reached the frosted glass door, I half expected it to be locked. It wasn't. A small brass plaque still read, "Elena Quan, Attorney at Law." The lettering was a little faded, but it was there. Inside, the office was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from thick walls and old carpeting. A single desk stood near the entrance, and behind it, sorting through a stack of files, was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a low bun. She looked up as I entered. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Miss Quan," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "My name is Delphine Armitage. You handled my grandfather's estate, years ago." His name was Andrew Crest. Her eyes sharpened with recognition almost immediately, and something in my chest loosened at that. "Ah," she said softly. "The woodworker. And the granddaughter who always smelled like sawdust." A brief smile touched her mouth. "Yes, I remember. Please, sit." We settled into a pair of armchairs in her small waiting area. Dust motes danced in the strip of sunlight that slipped through the blinds, turning the air into a quiet constellation. "I know it's been a long time," I began, fingers twisting together in my lap. "I received an email about Crestwood Workshop being sold. It referenced a contract I supposedly signed back in 2011, transferring my rights, permanently." The word tasted bitter. "I don't remember agreeing to that. I remember forms. I remember grief. But not that." She listened, hands folded, her gaze steady. When I finished, she took a slow breath. "Your uncle, Victor," she said. "He was the primary contact for the estate administration. You and your mother were beneficiaries, of course, but all instructions came through him." She hesitated. "I retired 3 years ago, but I keep my records. I can check what we have on file." I watched as she moved behind the desk and opened a filing cabinet, fingers sliding along labels until she found one marked, "Crest, Andrew." She drew out a thick manila folder and carried it back to the table with a care that made my heart ache. The sound of the metal clasp opening was deceptively simple. Inside were photocopies, handwritten notes, the neat architecture of a life translated into pages. She flipped through them with practiced efficiency until she found what she was looking for, a stapled packet titled, "Temporary Assignment and Access Agreement, Crestwood Workshop." "There were actually 2 versions of this," she said, brow furrowing. "I remember because your grandfather was very particular about his wishes where you were concerned." She slid the document across to me. The first page looked familiar, language about transferring beneficial interest of the workshop to Victor for estate management, with an explicit note about my right of access. I scanned it, heart pounding. Halfway down the page, there was a paragraph boxed in by hand-drawn lines, in blue ink that had bled slightly into the paper. I recognized the handwriting at once. Granddad's. "In the event that the Crestwood Workshop is to be mortgaged, sold, or otherwise conveyed to any third party, the clause read, "The consent of my granddaughter, Delphine Armitage, is required in writing. Absent such consent, my original intention stands. The workshop is to remain in her beneficial use, as a place of craft and rest." My throat tightened. I remembered him at the kitchen table, pen in hand, grumbling about how papers never say things the way people actually mean them. "This is the version I kept," Miss Kwan said. "Signed by your grandfather, your mother, and you. I assumed a copy was given to you, and to your uncle." Later, Victor requested a clean copy for his records, without what he called extraneous handwritten notes. "I refused to remove clauses without your grandfather's approval, so he said he'd handle it on his end." She met my eyes, and there was apology in her gaze, but also a flinty anger. "I should have insisted he take this exact version," she said quietly. "I assumed he would respect your grandfather's wishes." Lawyers are trained to be cynical, but I allowed myself a moment of optimism. "That's on me." I studied the signature line. My own name, alongside my grandfather's looping script and my mother's careful cursive. Date, March 14, 2011. "This clause," I said slowly. "It means he couldn't sell without my written consent. It means," she confirmed, "that any contract purporting to transfer your rights without that consent is, at minimum, questionable. Possibly void. Especially if an altered version was presented to third parties." The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. The old folder, the handwritten clause, my name inked beside my grandfather's, all of it coalesced into something solid. Proof not only of my rights, but of his intent. "Can I get a certified copy?" I asked. "Of course." She rose. "More than one. And if you'll allow it, I can refer you to a younger colleague who still practices. They're better placed to help you challenge this." As the scanner whirred softly in the background, I sat very still. The scent of the bakery downstairs drifted up, warm bread, sugar, cinnamon. It anchored me in the present even as I felt the past reshaping itself. For years, I'd lived with the quiet suspicion that my memories of that time were unreliable, softened by grief. Now, the paper in front of me told a different story. My grandfather hadn't been careless. He'd fought for clarity with ink and insistence. It was someone else who had decided that his words were extraneous. When Miss Kwan handed me the envelope, it felt heavier than its size allowed. Inside was the contract that was supposed to protect me. The old promise, no longer buried in someone else's filing cabinet. The moment that email came, I said, almost to myself, the past knocked. "And now," she replied, voice calm but firm, "you get to decide who opens the door, and what happens after." The conference room at Kwan and Associates partner firm was all glass and muted tones, the kind of neutral space designed to hold conflict without showing strain. Rain traced lazy paths down the wide windows, blurring the city beyond into streaks of motion and light. I sat at one end of the polished table, hands folded loosely in my lap. Next to me was my new attorney, a precise, soft-spoken woman named Talia Navarro. Across from us sat a representative from the development company, a man in an immaculate suit who kept checking his watch, and my Uncle Victor. It had been years since I'd seen him up close. He looked older, but not by much. The lines around his mouth had deepened into something permanent, his hair thinning at the temples. He still wore the same brand of watch, the same scent of expensive cologne. It struck me that grief had aged me in different ways than it had aged him. "Thank you all for coming," Talia began, her tone measured. "We're here to discuss the proposed sale of 72 Crestwood Lane, also known as Crestwood Workshop, and the underlying question of valid consent from my client, Ms. Delphine Armitage." Victor shifted in his seat. "We've already been over this," he said, though even his impatience came out quiet. "Delphine signed over her rights years ago. I have a signed contract. The developers have relied on it. This last-minute objection is Mr. Hale, Talia said gently, I'd ask that you allow us to walk through some documents first. Then we can discuss the implications for the development. She slid a folder onto the table, opening it so that the first page was visible to everyone, the version of the contract with my grandfather's handwritten clause, our 3 signatures lined at the bottom. I was provided with this by Ms. Elena Kwan, Talia continued. It is the executed version of the temporary assignment and access agreement that you referenced. You'll notice a handwritten clause, added and initialed by the decedent, Mr. Andrew Crest, and acknowledged by both his daughter and granddaughter. Victor's gaze flicked to the page, then away. The developer's representative leaned in, eyes narrowing as he scanned the text. This clause stipulates that any sale or conveyance of Crestwood Workshop to a third party requires Ms. Armitage's written consent, Talia said. No such consent exists. Furthermore, the version of the contract supplied to the development firm omits this clause entirely. She placed the second document beside the first, the scanned contract from the email. Identical heading, identical format, except for the neat absence of my grandfather's extraneous note. The difference was stark. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint patter of rain against glass and the distant whir of an air vent. My heartbeat was steady, not racing as I had feared it would. The proof sat on the table like a quiet witness. This is highly irregular, the developer's representative said slowly. We were assured the title was clean. We entered into a purchase agreement in good faith. And my client, Talia replied, entered into her grandfather's estate process in good faith. She trusted that his written wishes would be honored. Instead, a material clause was removed from the version you were given. At best, that's a serious oversight. At worst, it's fraudulent misrepresentation. Victor's jaw tightened. There was no fraud, he said. Andrew was sentimental. He scribbled things everywhere. The lawyer drew up the legally binding version. You requested a copy without the handwritten clause, Talia interjected calmly. We have Miss Kwan's notes confirming that. She refused to alter the signed agreement. You proceeded to present your own, cleaned version to third parties. Regardless of your intent, the fact remains, you cannot sell what you don't have clear authority over. The words were gentle, but their impact landed with the weight of something final. I watched my uncle, trying to trace the man I remembered under the one sitting here. As a child, I had admired his self-assurance, his neat clothes, his way of making decisions without hesitation. As a grieving teenager, I had leaned on that confidence like a crutch. Now, I saw the edges, the places where certainty shaded into entitlement. The developer's representative cleared his throat. Given this information, he said carefully, our firm cannot proceed with the transaction as is. Our legal department will need to review, but my preliminary view is that the purchase agreement is voidable. We won't risk litigation over unclear title. He closed his folder with quiet finality. Mr. Hale, we'll be in touch. Ms. Armitage, he added, nodding to me, I'm sorry for any distress this has caused you. When he left, the room felt larger and emptier. Victor stared at the documents a moment longer before finally looking at me. You could have come to me privately, he said. His voice held a rough edge. We're family. I met his gaze. I did, I replied softly. Back then. I trusted you when you said it was just paperwork. I trusted that you would keep your word about the workshop. His expression flickered, annoyance warring with something like guilt. You had the house, he said. You have your life, your job. The workshop was impractical. This sale would have benefited everyone. Everyone, I repeated, except the person it was promised to. The rain outside intensified for a moment, tapping lightly against the glass. In that sound, I heard the echo of grandfather's radio, the rasp of sandpaper, the soft scrape of wood against workbench. I'm not asking for anything extravagant, I continued. just for what was already mine. For the promises he put in writing. For the space he meant me to have. Talia spoke then, outlining options: formal recognition of my ownership stake, transfer of the workshop's title to my name, potential compensation for the attempted sale. Her tone stayed professional, but her support was a quiet anchor at my side. By the end of the meeting, there was no dramatic outburst, no sweeping apology. Instead, there were signatures on a settlement agreement that acknowledged my legal right to Crestwood and transferred full ownership of the workshop to me, free of encumbrances. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue further action over the altered contract. There were clauses about reputational harm, mutual non-disparagement. It was tidy, clinical. Yet beneath the neat paragraphs, something fundamental had shifted. As Victor signed, his hand trembled just slightly. I watched his pen move, the scratch of ink on paper loud in my ears. He didn't look at me again. When it was my turn, I signed with a hand that was steadier than I had expected. It wasn't revenge in the way stories usually tell it. No one shouted. No one stormed out. But as we left the building, my name was, once again, bound to Crestwood Workshop, not as an afterthought, not as something impractical, but as the rightful owner. Justice, I realized, could be quiet. It could look like a stack of papers, a clause restored, a promise honored at last. The key to Crestwood Workshop was heavier than I remembered. It was late afternoon when I stood in front of the old building, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The house my uncle now lived in rose modestly at the front of the property, curtains drawn. We hadn't spoken since the settlement meeting, communicating only through lawyers regarding practical details. That was a silence I could live with. The workshop itself sat behind the house, just as it always had, weathered faded to a gentle gray, the roof patched in places. A thin line of smoke curled from a neighboring chimney, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. I walked along the narrow path of cracked concrete, my steps stirring fallen leaves. At the door, I slipped the key into the lock. The metal turned with a reluctant click, as if the building had forgotten the sound of my hand. The smell hit me first. Dust, old wood, faint traces of oil and varnish, layered scents that seemed to rise up in greeting. Light slanted in through the small windows near the ceiling, catching the floating dust motes and turning them into slow-moving specks of gold. Everything was smaller than it had been in my childhood, of course. The workbenches, once towering, were now at a practical height. Shelves lined the walls, tools hanging in neat arrangements, some rusted, others still sharp. A clock above the door had stopped at some forgotten hour, its second hand frozen mid-tick. In the corner, my corner, stood the small workbench my grandfather had built just for me. The stool was gone, but the bench remained, scuffed and scarred. My initials, carved with more enthusiasm than skill, were still visible on the edge, D.A. I ran my fingers over the letters. The wood was cool under my skin. For a long time I simply stood there, listening to the quiet. Outside, the world went on, cars passing, distant voices, the low murmur of everyday life. In here, time folded in on itself, past and present overlapping. I thought of my mother, asleep back at the bungalow, her memories flickering like a faulty light. When I told her about the settlement, she'd furrowed her brow, trying to pull the right thread out of the tangle. Your grandfather wanted you to have a place, she'd said eventually, eyes shining with a clarity that cut through the fog for a moment. I remember that much. He said, Dell will need somewhere to build things. Maybe not furniture, but a life. Her words had settled somewhere deep inside me. I moved slowly around the workshop, opening drawers, brushing dust off old plans, carefully picking up an unfinished chair leg that still bore the marks of my grandfather's chisels. I found a small wooden box tucked on a shelf above my old bench, its lid slightly warped. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brittle at the edges. It was a note in his handwriting. Dell, it read. If you're reading this, I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted. This place is yours as much as it ever was mine. Don't let anyone turn it into something it isn't. Use it, change it, or just keep it as a place to breathe. Either way, it's meant for you. The ink had faded, but the words were intact. My breath left me in a slow, controlled exhale. There was a time when finding this would have broken me open. Now, it felt like confirmation of what I'd known, beneath all the doubt, all along. Quietly, I leaned against the nearest workbench and took in the space as it was, old, imperfect, waiting. Owning Crestwood didn't suddenly erase the years of small compromises and disappointments that had shaped my life. It didn't repair my relationship with Victor or restore the time my mother and I had spent in cramped apartments, counting every bill. What it did offer was something simpler, but no less powerful. Choice. I could turn the workshop into a studio, a place where local artisans rented benches, where kids learned to sand wood with the grain instead of against it. I could keep it mostly as it was, a sanctuary where I came to sort through my thoughts amidst the smell of pine and varnish. I could, eventually, sell it on my own terms, when it meant moving towards something rather than being pushed away from my past. What mattered was that the decision now rested in my hands. I set my grandfather's note back in the wooden box and placed it on my bench, a small anchor in the room. Then I opened the windows, letting fresh air flood in, stirring dust from its long sleep. The light changed as it poured through, brightening corners, catching on old nails, revealing cobwebs that had gathered in neglect. In the doorway, I paused and looked back. The contract, once a weapon turned against me, now sat at home in a slim file folder, its most important clause restored. It was no longer a threat, it was part of the story of how I had learned to read every line in my life more carefully, not just the ones in legal documents. It reminded me that silence, too, was a kind of permission, and that I could choose, at any time, to withdraw it. As I stepped out into the fading afternoon, locking the door behind me, I felt a quiet shift inside. Not triumph, exactly. Something steadier than that. I had taken back what was mine, not through rage or destruction, but by insisting that the truth on paper matched the truth in memory. By honoring the weight of a promise made long ago in a workshop that smelled of sawdust and evening light. On the walk back to my car, the air held the coolness that comes just before night falls. I slipped the key into my pocket, feeling its outline press against my palm with each step. It was more than metal now. It was proof that some things, once lost, can be reclaimed, not as they were, but as they are meant to be. And that, I thought, might be enough.